Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We're reaching a critical state where most of us are trying to figure out how can we go ahead and give back to something that's been giving so abundantly to us since we were born. On the program today, we're going to be covering this very subject, but we're going to do it in a very light-hearted way with a lot of solutions. In other words, a lot of us can tend to see the problem, but as I remember a friend of mine once saying, once you see that there is a problem, you automatically become the solution. On the program today, our guest started out herding goats in New Mexico as a little boy, and then he went on to starting Ogden Publications, which publishes such publications as Mother Earth News, Natural Home, and the Utiny Reader. He also serves on the board of directors for the MPA, which is the Association of Magazine Media, and he's very actively involved in social things that move to making this place a beautiful place to live. The book is Bountiful and Abundant, Building the World That We Want. And I'd like to welcome to our guest the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Mr. Brian Welch.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Doing well, thank you. Now, wonderful things about this book is that it brings simplicity back to a question that a lot of people seem to feel that's very daunting. Tell us about what's going on here.
Well, the single biggest thing that's going on is there are about twice as many people on the planet today as there were when I was born.
Right.
And in a nutshell, as any farmer knows, if you keep putting cattle on the same pasture and you double the number of cattle in a given length of time, eventually you're going to max out that resource base. You're going to have malnutrition and disease, and you're going to kind of wreck the habitat for your animals. And, you know, we've done an awe-inspiring job of feeding people these past couple of hundred years as the population has been growing so rapidly. But there are just plain physical limits. And climate change is a symptom of our population expansion. Species loss is a symptom of our population expansion, as are many other things like deforestation and desertification around the world. So, in a nutshell, I mean, that's the simplest way of encapsulating the story of the past 200 years on this planet. Humanity has come to have a really enormous impact on its own habitat. You and I, members of the only species in the universe, so far as we know, that can conceptualize its own impact on its habitat, we happen to be lucky enough to be here at this kind of definitive moment for humanity, where we're really, for the first time, grappling with our responsibilities.
You know, and the other thing, too, that a lot of people may tend to overlook is was brought to light by anthropologist Wade Davis, is that we are also losing languages at the rate of close to 1,200 a year. And he says basically what that is also entailing is it's like losing an old-growth forest, that all the ancient ways of being and doing on this planet are beginning to disappear. And he even contends and goes on to say, you know, just imagine that you're the last person on planet Earth who speaks the language you speak. You know, so it gets rid of a lot of traditional ways of the way people used to connect with the planet that we live on today.
Yeah, for better or for worse, we are living much closer together as a species, and, you know, we're much more in constant contact with each other. And, you know, there's pluses and minuses. I mean, I will say that human technology has obviously made human life in sort of superficial ways much more pleasant than ever was before. Mm-hmm. We live longer. We're less violent than we've ever been. We are comparatively wealthy. We're comparatively well fed. And we're not in as much pain. We don't suffer as much as previous generations of human beings. But, as you say, all of that also lends to an environment in which we're not very closely connected with nature, a lot of us. We're not very closely connected to the fundamental laws of existence as it was created by, you know, on this biological planet. So there are pluses and minuses associated with that, and we probably have to work a little harder to have any true understanding of how nature works and of our role, our place on this planet, and for that matter, in the universe.
You know, I was just thinking, it was just not so long ago, I was talking with my wife, and this was a time when, a lot of us tend to dream through hitting it big, let's say, in the lottery. That we have this, this vision that, something like this will improve our lives from what they are at this moment. And she had asked me, she says, if you were to, win that much money, I think at the time it was close to $500 million. It was just a phenomenal amount. I said, well, I know, what I would do is, you consider the toys that a lot of people would tend to buy, and what I actually looked at was saying, I'd rather invest in the companies, I guess, that would have these things, because A, I wouldn't need to own it. It would be maintenance. I would actually have a cash flow spinoff. It would also cause people to be able to be employed, and I would also be able to share these things with other people, which reduces the need for people to be able to have these things for themselves. And I remember coming across one of the chapters in your book, The Power of Invention, and I thought you had 4 things in here that really, if people begin to incorporate these attitudes within their daily lives toward what they do each day as they get up, that it would actually change themselves individually. And a lot of us want to run out and we run and gun and we want to change the world. We just seem to have this within us to do this. Then we realize the world is so huge and the problems seem to just be so gargantuan that we just tend to give up. But I figured if you could follow these 4 things that you talk about in here, that it wouldn't seem as impossible as it tends to seem as we, wake up deciding this is going to be our task. And these 4 things are that you decide it's beautiful, it creates abundance, it's fair, and it's contagious. Share with us what those are.
Well, starting from the top, first of all, I like to ask them as questions, about all the things I do. Is what I'm doing creating beauty in the world?
Right.
And that's super important if you want to engage other people in the pursuit of something better. Because engaging other people, people are fundamentally inspired by beauty. And there are very few sources of human inspiration that don't incorporate beauty. So I think it's very important, in particular, for bringing other people along on the voyage that one is on, and, of course, in engaging the imaginations and the enthusiasms of other people is absolutely critical to achieving what I would like to achieve, which is a beautiful, abundant, permanent human presence on the planet. The second question, does it create abundance? Without abundance, we really can't be creative in the way we need to be, in the ways we need to be. In business, the thing that we call abundance, or the word that stands for abundance in business, is capital. And everybody knows in business that if you don't have sufficient capital, you can't innovate, because you can't try things that might not work if you don't have a little extra capital on hand. If you can't afford to lose a little bit here and there, you never create anything new. And innovation is going to be critical to our survival in the future. And then back on the topic of engaging other people in the pursuit of sustainability, I mean, it's quite obvious. The 7 billion people around the world, all those societies that represent those 7 billion people have to be engaged in the pursuit of sustainability, or we're not going to get there. If the country across the border is burning high sulfur coal and pumping the air full of pollution, then everybody in your country is going to suffer right along with your neighbors. And that's true of virtually every kind of environmental hazard. We are all in the same boat together these days. If our ideas are not fair to all concerned, if they don't incorporate the desires, needs, and perspectives of other people around the world, in other words, if everybody doesn't stand to benefit from the improvements we're making, then they won't engage with us and won't support what we're doing. So again, we won't have the kind of consensus we need to move forward. And the last idea, maybe in a way that's sort of the most controversial of the ideas, is it contagious? I think we as environmentalists, and I've been an environmental journalist for several decades, we as environmentalists have done a poor job of expressing our ideas in ways that encourage other people to stand up and march with us. I think far too often we've gotten on our sort of high horse and spoken from a holier-than-thou perspective on these issues of sustainability and environmental protection.
Sort of like vegetarians.
Well, you name any category of environmentalists, vegetarians. There's a whole bunch of us who've been far too likely to preach from the pulpit rather than gathering people around us and engaging their enthusiasm for our ideas. And so I think, Mother Earth News is the biggest part of my business. It's the most successful environmental medium of all time. And I think it is that because it's always been about cool stuff you can do as an individual.
Right.
And lots of the people who read Mother Earth News do not identify themselves as environmentalists. They're just conscientious people who want to do the right thing in the world. And I think conscientious people are pretty common. I think the vast majority of human beings are fundamentally conscientious and can be engaged in this conversation, in this quest to create a sustainable and prosperous human presence on the planet for centuries to come.
And there's really the key ideal there, Brian, is that you engage these people to take the steps and to learn these things necessary. It's funny because a lot of times you hear the big argument, well, it's big oil doing this, or, it goes on and on. And I'm thinking, well, that's fine, but, the argument really starts with how do you spend your money, And if you can find alternative ways to do what you're doing that bring you a lot more pleasure, that really move you in the direction, for instance, that you want to see yourself participating in, then you've already become that change that you're wishing to see. And it's real easy in a lot of cases for us as humans to point our finger and blame, the bad things outside of ourselves. But each and every day, a lot of us make those choices that contribute to the problems that we keep saying we want to, see changed. And it becomes a funny argument after a while.
It's a very, very good point. And Daniel, in the current world where our activities as business people are pretty transparent, it's pretty easy to get on the internet and find out how a business is run and who runs it and what their priorities are and how they how they treat people, how they treat the environment. All that is pretty accessible. Consumers have more power than ever. Consumers can choose companies that do the right thing. As soon as consumers start doing that, as soon as they start incorporating conscientiousness in their buying decisions, big business moves very rapidly. As soon as voters set higher standards for the behavior of their government, and as soon as voters change their mind about what matters to them in an election, big government changes overnight. And so really, I think to a greater degree than ever before, the individual consumer, the individual voter, has an enormous amount of power, thanks to largely to the digital media, to the proliferation of media. The individual has much more power than ever before, and individual people can make a difference. And you can't all day long marching up down the street and shouting about big corporations or big government is much less effective than convincing a few thousand of your associates and friends that something is important, whatever your subject might be, whatever your initiative might be. Convincing a few thousand people who know you through Facebook that this is a very important issue can make a big difference in the world.
Well, not to mention, as you said, in taking action. I'll give an example from your book. You talk about Earthships. And that in itself reminded me of times, as we've been broadcasting our program for now 8 years, is that we have covered really interesting and dynamic ways that people are actually making these changes. They are affecting their lifestyles through doing things differently, and one of those was through hay homes, where people actually build homes with hay. Talking about what it's like to live off the grid by alternative sources of power. But this Earthship thing, I've got to say, I didn't remember really coming across anything quite like this before. Describe those for us.
Yeah, well, a fellow an architect named Michael Reynolds, who lives in northern New Mexico, where I used to live, started, 35 years ago, taking basically waste materials, garbage, tin cans, old bottles, discarded tires, and pulling them together in these miraculous houses he builds, using them as building materials. And over the years, he really has greatly refined this thing so that it's really down to a science. If you have enough time available, a little bit of labor to lend to the project, you can build a house at a phenomenally low cost that is unbelievably energy efficient and incorporates an indoor garden into the house and water, capturing rainwater into the house. So these homes are both beautiful. They're very easily adapted to an off-the-grid style of life, and they reuse materials which otherwise would end up in landfills. It's just a really ingenious application of some basic common sense to an area where tradition has sort of carried the day. And the vast majority of homes are built kind of the same way across North America. They all kind of look the same. Well, the vast majority of them kind of look the same. And he just sort of blew that idea up and said, well, if we were going to create the perfect house for all these reasons, the environment and economics and comfort, how would we do it? And so he invented the Earthship, and I think it's a great representation of something that's beautiful, abundant, fair, and very contagious. People who learn about them tend to get carried away and decide they have to live in one themselves, and for good reason.
The obsessive human component, right?
Absolutely.
And the thing was, is I became very interested in how Dennis Weaver's home must have looked. I mean, here was one that was apparently a multi-million-dollar Earthship.
It's huge, and you can go see it. It's in southern Colorado and perfectly accessible. Yeah, it's a really, really huge, palatial, off-the-grid Earthship, and a great statement for their flexibility and the fact that they're not merely for the folks up on the mesa. It's really anybody at any income level can adapt the Earthship lifestyle to their own desires and their own needs.
Now, one of the biggest, I suppose, arguments that we face this day and age that you hear quite a bit about is the burning and depletion of fossil fuels. You talk about alternative energy sources. Obviously, solar comes to a lot of people's minds. Then there's also wind power. Living in Portland, Oregon, for instance, I know that if you go out to the gorge, you begin to slowly see these windmill farms where, giant windmills are actually put up. And this actually also spawns a whole new other industry that once these things are up, then, there's a requirement of maintenance. But there's also been some controversy about whether or not these things are good. So if we could, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about wind power. That it seems good, but then at the same time, I know just recently I came across a documentary that maybe it's not as good as it seems to be. But what is your perspective on this?
Well, I think it's almost as good as it seems to be, Daniel. I mean,
okay.
It's very, very good. There's going to be collateral damage anytime you have a big industrial installation of any kind, and a wind farm is a big industrial installation. But the brilliance of it, is that it doesn't really consume anything once it's up and running. There's some damage to bird life. The little bit of the land is used up for the foundations for the windmills and whatnot. But you can certainly graze animals or farm or do a lot of other things within, right underneath the wind farms. And compared to the damage done by extracting fossil fuels, distributing fossil fuels, and burning fossil fuels, wind energy is miles ahead, far more sustainable, far less destructive of the natural habitat than most of the other ways we have of generating electricity. But there's a lot of other exciting things going on out there in terms of alternative energy that are also far superior to fossil fuels. Big solar electric installations, that is, solar installations that are designed to generate electricity. There's several of them up and down the central desert in California that are generating, the power for hundreds of thousands of homes, and across Western Europe as well. Geothermal, most of Northern California and Southern Oregon is supplied electric power by a big geothermal installation in Northern California. It's been there for 30 years, generating power at virtually no incremental cost. Geothermal costs a lot to install, but then you have effectively a permanent source of power. And it's astonishing in its abundance, and it's the impact on the environment is just a shadow of the impact of burning fossil fuels again. So we're almost at, and some people think we're already at parity. That is, solar and wind power cost about the same as burning fossil fuels today, and as the fossil fuel reserves are depleted, the renewable sources will get cheaper while fossil fuels get more expensive, and the seesaw is tipping. From my perspective, if we were investing the effort we put into the extraction of fossil fuels into renewable energy, both innovation in developing renewable energy and the development of renewable energy resources, then our great-grandchildren would be far better off. And that's my goal, is creating a terrific place for my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren to live.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree with you more. Now, one of the things that I know that's really true is that we also still have a very archaic way that we supply energy, and that's on this thing, called the grid. And I like in this part here where you say the smart grid, our current power grids are dumb. You might even say they're even stupid in some ways. But describe how that can change itself to change a lot of what we're doing.
I'd like to talk about the power grid in terms of security. Mm-hmm. And you can think of it in terms of national security. That is, our ability to operate in a safe environment, even if we have enemies who want to undermine our safety and our society. Or you could just think of it in terms of power security. That is, if you depend on electricity for your health, your livelihood, your comfort, then wouldn't we all be far more secure if there were literally hundreds of millions of individual power producers across the country?
Right.
If millions of people had windmills in their backyards or photovoltaics on their roofs, or any number of other small-scale power generation technologies. Spreading out power generation across the country would make us more secure. It would be far more efficient. We wouldn't lose the power we lose in transmission, and we'd be able to distribute power where it's needed, when it's needed, in a much more technologically sound way. The essential thing we need in order to make all that work is a smart grid. That is, a grid that allows people to meter both the electricity coming into their homes and the electricity going out, and a reliable way then of paying people for the electricity they put into the grid, as well as charging them for the electricity they take off. The technology is available, it's at our fingertips, but there's actually, to my amazement, been some resistance on the part of power companies to installing and implementing the technology. I think it's inevitable. The sooner we have it, the better. And gosh, talk about something that could overnight revolutionize renewable energy, because if there were millions of homeowners across the country and millions of business people across the country who saw an economic opportunity in the installation of their own alternative energy generated sources, then I see that whole industry and the level of technology expanding exponentially in a short time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the other questions that we tend to face too is food, and obviously there's a lot of great big changes that are happening in this when it comes to community sustainable agriculture. And I remember the opportunity that I had to go with my wife to visit with her parents in Chicago. And they live just outside of Chicago, actually about 25 minutes north. And her father is from the Philippines, and he loves gardening. And you see that in this neighborhood he lives in, all the brick homes, as you'd mentioned earlier, all look the same. It seems all the homes in America, one way or the other, they look the same.
Right.
You have the front yard, the kept grass. The only difference was his home completely stood out. And that was, you've seen giant beds of kale and the like, and then you go into the backyard and you just see, herbs, spices, beans, and just this abundance of neighborhood wildlife in this small plot that's not really very big. And, she says that he always had this approach to gardening because he says, Flowers, they look pretty, and these bushes, they all look nice, but you can't eat them. And he grows enough food, obviously, off of his land that he actually ends up sharing with family and friends. It's just a constant thing, and he loves doing it. And plus, you also attract a lot of animals there, which he actually sets traps out for. He traps them. He ends up taking them out to the park and letting them go. Interestingly enough, on the night we arrived, as I stepped out of their vehicle, I noticed there was this animal caged right in the area that I stepped out in. And I said, I couldn't tell what it was. It was too dark. And I said, well, what's that? He says, I don't know, just kind of in passing. He says, I think it's a skunk. Okay.
Yeah.
The funny thing is the next day, he was out in the backyard with this skunk that was actually in this cage trapped. And he was feeding it by hand. And I was kind of surprised because the first thing you think of skunk, you need to get the heck away from these things. But he went on to explain, he says, no, it's defense. Once they see you and know you, they generally, you won't have to worry about that. Was so confident that he put this skunk in this cage in the back of his vehicle as they went to go pick up a birthday cake for my birthday. Then they let this skunk go in this park and came back, and you would have never known there was a skunk in this vehicle. But the thing was, this guy really had a grip on the natural world, and one of the neat little stories that I remember you were talking about in here was, for instance, how you actually trained a cat not to eat the baby the chickens, which also reminded me of a lady who has a community sustainable agricultural farm up in Washington, and she says the cats, or this one cat used to like to kill birds, and put them to where she could see it was thinking it was doing its job, and she says, this is how I train the cats not to do this. And I thought, train cats? I always thought they were independently thinking. But she says, when you do this, she says, now all of a sudden the cat was showing that it wasn't doing that anymore. And it's funny that when we can engage in nature, that it also begins to teach us not only a lot about ourselves, but how to actually be in a symbiotic relationship with it. So growing food, not just for the sake of eating, but for the sake of actually growing ourselves, is one of those tasks that I think are completely worth doing.
Certainly a big part of my life, and something that I've found a very rich part of my life ever since I was a kid. We raise cattle and sheep and goats on our farm, and it takes us out in nature every day. It engages us with nature in a collaborative effort to maintain the natural resource and to feed ourselves. And emotionally, we're involved with the animals, and it opens the world up in interesting ways and gives us perspectives that aren't purely human. And I think that's very valuable and something that my wife and I value in our day-to-day lives very deeply.
Mm-hmm. Now, and new technology, as you were talking about earlier, it seems to be taking a beating, especially when it comes to things like Facebook and Google. And one of the big things that a lot of people are becoming concerned with are the losses of, they feel, privacy. In other words, information that is being used sort of without our permission. But you talk about these entities, especially Google, in your book. Now, how can people come to understand and see companies like this in a favorable light through what we're talking about here? It's beautiful, creates abundance, it's fair, and it's contagious.
Well, a big company like Google has the opportunity to do a lot of good in the world, or evil, depending on how they choose to run the company. Google has at least made the effort to operate in a conscientious way, to reduce the amount of power it consumes, to generate more of its own power, to research alternative energy sources, to treat employees with respect, kindness, compassion, and to operate overseas only in places where they can be confident that their employees are well treated and that the social conditions are fair. So, any large organization with a lot of power in the world has the opportunity to do a lot of good or a lot of evil. And my point about Google is they've at least tried pretty hard to do the right things. And they are part, I think, of a sort of revolution in the way businesses are being run. The old-fashioned, first-generation capitalist enterprise only cared about economic expansion and delivering money to the shareholders. Mm-hmm. In order to do that effectively, though, in this new world we're entering, you're also going to have to be able to show customers and other allies in business that you're behaving conscientiously and in a way that takes care of people and takes care of the environment. So in order to be economically successful in the new capitalism, you're going to have to also take into account other forms of value, the welfare of human beings and animals and plants and habitats worldwide. I think that's very exciting and a source of enormous power for positive change.
I found it funny when I had read it, started off a chapter where you said for a long time you disrespected turkeys, and sometimes as you read through this book, you think, boy, that seems to be a contrast from what I think I was just reading. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, that's I guess you're commenting on an aspect of my daily life. I mean, I run a company. I run a media company. I spend a lot of time sharing ideas with people that are relatively new, and I spend a lot of time working on expressing these ideas in clear and effective ways. All of that being kind of cerebral. But the business of running a farm like mine is largely instinctive, and a lot of problems are solved by leaning on something really hard or just bending it back into place. And I really value that contrast. And sharing your life with a couple of hundred animals of various kinds, gosh, every day that's another story. And you're experiencing the world from a lot of different perspectives. Right now we're lambing, and so right at the moment we have about 45 or 50 lambs on the ground, and each of them, the oldest of them is about a week old, and the 1-day-old lambs experience the world in a very different way than the 5-year-old lambs, who experience it differently than the 7-day-old lambs. Well, if you're close to the natural world and close to these creatures, you get this sense of richness from seeing the world through a variety of eyes that I think is valuable and helps us care about the environment and the natural world on an emotional level, which to me, in my work, in my profession, in my career, has been very important. And it's very important to my peace of mind as well. So yeah, I mean, turkeys are a creature that have not been successful on my farm. I still don't have great empathy for them, but I have seen some turkeys do some remarkably intelligent things, as well as some remarkably unintelligent things over the years. It's just all part of that experience of seeing the world through a variety of different eyes.
Fascinating stuff. The book is beautiful and abundant, and I believe that all of us can achieve that, as well as we already are that. All we have to do is reawaken into ourselves to be able to move in that direction. Our guest today, Brian Welch. Brian, do you have a website people can find out more?
Sure, MotherEarthNews.com or BeautifulAndAbundant.com.
Fascinating stuff. Brian, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Daniel.
We also thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. Be sure to get started. Visit us at our website as well, which is beyond50radio.com, the number 50. We do have a free weekly e-newsletter. We'll also post a hot link here to Brian's website as well. Book is Beautiful and Abundant. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is Beyond 50, and remember, live your day past that.